Thank you for joining us this morning, and I'm very happy to see all the interested parties here. Again, let me begin by greeting the traditional landowners, past and present of this place, especially Auntie Brenda Hodge, who gave us a warm welcome this morning. I'm very thankful for this opportunity to deliver the keynote for our session, and in the true Finnish style, I'll be also speaking by giving Peter Pulsifier's presentation, so you have to suffer twice the views that I have, or we have, let's say, in the Arctic. So I work for Snowchange, which has been doing these kind of things for 16 years in the Arctic through the various assessments that's going on, for example, the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, and more recently, the Arctic Biodiversity Assessment. And what I really have for you today is a set of 4 images with the idea and a question also regarding our conference: what are the mechanisms, what are the ways to try to bridge the gaps and provide dialogue between different knowledge traditions, namely what's often known as the indigenous knowledge or the traditional knowledge of the indigenous peoples and local communities globally, and then the science community here, most likely the natural sciences. So it's a very short PowerPoint, but I'll explain each image according to the title, the Communal Visual Histories. But let's begin with this mask here that comes from southwestern Alaska, done by the Yup'ik people, the indigenous Inuit nation living in the delta of the Yukon River. This mask, which is about 116 years of age, was used in the nighttime ceremonies of the Yup'ik people, and it's a sort of a stylish head of a fish with fins. But the mask also portrays a tradition where it belongs into the so-called windmaker masks that were used by the indigenous peoples, the Yup'ik, and are partly used even today to evoke 2 fundamental aspects of their lives: the fish and their relations with the fish, and the wind that moves the sea in which the fish live. And the reason why I want to try to begin with this image here is to make the point that if we try to discuss the indigenous knowledge tradition having value on its own, which is obviously the case here, we have to position the various visual traditions of these peoples in a long range of recording their observations over thousands of years. In fact, you could argue that the visual way of recording events, changes, and important relations, such as visible in the mask here, on the mask here, span thousands of years, ranging from rock art to the masks and other expressions of visual culture and things in the community life. Not all of you may be familiar with the idea of traditional knowledge. It's often seen as, or defined as, knowledge, belief, practice. So it's done, lived, known, and it has its own sets of validation, observation, and the way it's passed on, whether in oral, visual, or other means. The other very crucial realization by this time is the fact that it's often seen as a holistic engagement with the local places and ecosystems. What does it really mean? Leads to us to understand that it operates on its own time space. In other words, there are other kind of ways of measuring time, space, dimensions, and other things than the expected Western norms of demarcations of time and space. None of these endemic or culturally relevant time spaces are of less value than the Western science. They are just often seen to be fundamentally different than the dominant discourse on knowledge. Also central to the traditional knowledge of the Arctic peoples is the idea of an event. If you try to summarize somehow this idea of an event in the world where these communities and cultures live, all of us, is the idea that things happen as they are meant to happen. And this is really the underlying principle of the three quick cases that I'll share with you today, with the sense that nothing happens by accident. Nothing is recorded or portrayed outside the communities by accident. And in that sense, the observations and the decisions of the indigenous and local communities to share their histories to the outside, which is often the science, the government, the businesses, the art world, or the general society, is an act done with the highest consciousness and importance. The fact that we don't often see the endemic decision-making and the knowledge patterns in a community doesn't, again, take away any of their inherent power and the justification why certain events or observations are shared. And this is a very crucial point to talk about when we are discussing data. Indigenous peoples, local communities that are possessing these traditions and knowledge systems very often attack very strongly the idea of a data flow. Yeah, there are things that we can do together, but they are not just only data for some consumption in science or different research activities. So the point here is that traditional knowledge systems have value of their own, and very often the collective, the community, the family, reindeer herders, hunters, fishermen, the women, choose to share the things that they feel are crucial in their own world. So this morning I'll just give you three very quick examples of different scales of how things look like from this approach. This is the recorded first observation of a scarabæic beetle, Potosia cuprea, in northern Sami area in Finland. It's a southern species that was recorded. The first observation of this beetle so far up at 69 degrees north was recorded and observed by the local Skoltsami fishermen and reindeer herders, with the idea in this particular project to try to document how their lands and waters are changing in a way that we provided them with digital cameras at the beginning of the season, and with the mandate that why don't you record anything that's valuable or relevant from your perspective. We don't impose, we don't give any guidelines for this community and the group of herders and fishermen involved. It's up to you to decide within your knowledge traditions and your way of life and the river what is crucial, and then at the end of the season, let's see what you come up with. And they came up with the beetle and the very first recorded observation of this beetle so far north. And this is a remarkable example in that sense that it shows the scale of how these Sami reindeer herders were observing their catchment area and basin. We are often stuck in our notions of what traditions are and what traditional knowledge can provide. We are either stuck by the models created by outsiders, which talk about the noble savage, the romantic indigenous person who lived in some kind of an ecological balance without any impacts to the ecosystems. Or we are stuck in the image of the indigenous peoples being the drunk person on the street, the lazy, unemployed, lots of abuse, and many other things. and don't really get beyond the stereotypes. We don't really get beyond the real engagement that these communities have with their ecosystems and places for hundreds, in some cases, thousands of years. So let's start small. That's why I want to come here with the beetle and say, this is a scale of the most smallest possible change that you can see, provided by 5 Sami reindeer herders when they were trusted on their own terms to record what's significant for them. The third photo, or the visual history that I'm giving to you, comes from northern Russia. This is another Sami tribe, another watershed in the region of Ponoi in Murmansk region, Kola Peninsula. Here the community utilized old photographs taken in 1880s of the landscape, and then in 2006 they recorded the same exact spot to determine what has changed. Obviously, the one in black and white comes from 1886, and the one in colors comes from 2006. So there's a span of 120 years of a landscape observation, visual documentation by the local people and others who are visiting this catchment area, and again, agency. The Sami are acting using these archive photos and comparing them with the ones they are holding dear at this time in 2006 to see how things have changed, or in this case, where the landscape has retained most of its characteristics. So here we can talk about the idea of how the Sami are engaged in a landscape scale to document change, or in this case, fairly preserved state for the Ponoi River. The last photo that I have time for, or I want to share with you, was something that I touched on last night with the public session. And this is coming from Siberia, northeastern corner of Siberia in Kolyma, lower Kolyma region, where the temperatures can go down to -60 as they are at the moment. And at the same time, this is the region where the permafrost is melting in a severe speed. Again, now we are trying to witness a landscape scale change. The man in front of you is my very dear brother, Pyotr Kaurgin, and this is a photo the reindeer herders took themselves when the first collapsed permafrost walls surrounding certain rivers and lakes started to melt. So that's how permafrost melt looks like on the surface. And again, it's about 12 years old photo. And again, this led to a realization done by the local reindeer herders, the women and the fishermen, that something of a massive scale is taking place. Now, again, the indigenous peoples may have, in this particular case, their own ways of trying to interpret and come to terms with this change. What's relevant is that they took the action to pass these photos and the markings on maps and other things to researchers to convey the message that this is real, it's happening, it's here, and we have to also bear in mind that in this case the community travels 400 kilometers north to south on their seasonal migrations with the nomadic reindeer herding. So the landscapes and the territory they cover as a part of their traditional land use and occupancy is massive. We are talking about hundreds of kilometers by hundreds of kilometers of ecosystem engagement, place names, oral histories, and in this case, a visual history done by the community. This led the Chukchi reindeer herders to establish a range of actions to come to terms with the melt. One of them has to do with this sharing of sites, sharing of observations with scientists and the media. You may have heard of the same kind of permafrost changes up in other parts of Siberia with the so-called craters last summer. Again, these were first detected in many cases by the local nenets and other reindeer herders, where the permafrost is melting on a very strange phenomena, creating craters that are on the landscape and not easy to explain. So there's one step that the community did to try to respond to the changes underway. Secondly, they chose to, as their strategic move to survive, they chose to maintain their nomadic rounds and reindeer herding by altering certain directions, but still maintain their own way of life. And lastly, they established the nomadic schools to make sure that the children are also being immersed in the traditional way of life, despite the fact that the landscapes are changing. So these are just very quickly 4 cases of how the local and indigenous communities in the Arctic are recording and have been recording for millennia their own events, histories, and then chosen to share them outside when they feel it's appropriate to do so. The point here is to say indigenous peoples are very much an agency. They are very much up to speed, and they are very much able to contribute to very positive changes, very positive partnerships in science, such as detecting species or change on the land, as long as their traditional livelihoods and occupancy continues. The trouble is that there's no knowledge, there's no observations, and there's no partnerships if these age-old occupancies are stopped. And therefore, we need to also support the culture, the language, the rights and ways of life of indigenous peoples if we are to maintain these partnerships. Thank you very much.